The emergency beacon had been screaming across the galaxy for 3 months straight, its desperate signal bouncing from star to star like a cry for help that nobody wanted to answer. Every major civilization in the known universe had heard it by now. The message was simple and terrifying. The Galactic Coalition was dying, and they needed heroes. The beacon carried with it horrifying reports that made even the bravest species think twice. Entire worlds had gone dark. Billions of lives snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. The enemy they called the Devourers wasn't just conquering planets. They were consuming everything in their path, leaving behind nothing but empty husks floating in space. When the Coalition first sent out their call for help, they expected the usual suspects to step forward. The noble Altarian knights had saved the galaxy twice before, their gleaming ships and ancient warrior traditions the stuff of legend. But this time, they were too busy arguing about honor codes and whether fighting such savage enemies would taint their noble souls. The wise Centauri peacekeepers, famous for ending conflicts with diplomacy instead of weapons, had formed a committee. They were still debating the ethical implications of violence while worlds burned. Their debates had been going on for 2 months with no end in sight. The proud vegan empire claimed their forces were tied up in strategic repositioning, which everyone knew meant they were too scared to fight. The crystalline beings of the Outer Rim had simply gone silent, sealing their borders and pretending the problem didn't exist. One by one, every great civilization found excuses. The galaxy's champions, it seemed, had better things to do than actually champion anything. Then Earth answered. Ambassador Veltar of the Ethereal Council had been sipping his ceremonial morning beverage when the human ships dropped out of hyperspace above the Coalition's emergency staging area. He nearly choked as the liquid went down the wrong tube, his 4 eyes widening in disbelief. These weren't the gleaming vessels of legend that stories were written about. The human ships looked like they'd been built in someone's backyard using spare parts and sheer determination. Hull plates were mismatched, weapon systems had clearly been added as afterthoughts, and everything seemed to be held together with some kind of metallic tape and what humans apparently called hope. But they were here. After 3 months of silence from the galaxy's greatest heroes, a species nobody had ever heard of had answered the call. The humans who stepped off their ships didn't match any of the heroic tales Veltar had grown up with. They didn't wear shining armor that caught the light dramatically. They didn't carry ancient swords passed down through generations of noble warriors. Instead, they wore practical gray uniforms that looked designed for actual work rather than parades. Their weapons were blocky, efficient-looking things that seemed more focused on getting the job done than looking impressive. General Jake Martinez announced their leader, stepping forward with a kind of confidence that made Veltar instinctively step back. She was a woman probably in her 40s, with short crop hair and a collection of scars across her face and hands that spoke of experience in ways that made the ambassador uncomfortable. This wasn't someone who had earned their rank through politics or bloodline. This was someone who had clawed their way to the top through actual combat. Jake looked around the command center with sharp, calculating eyes, taking in the tactical displays and strategic maps with the same casual interest someone might show when choosing what to have for lunch. When her gaze fell on the holographic display, showing devourer positions and attack patterns, she didn't flinch or gasp like every other species had done. Instead, she nodded like she was looking at a problem that had an obvious solution. "So," she said in a voice that carried just a hint of an accent Veltar couldn't place, "these things eat people alive for entertainment? Yeah, we can work with that." The casual way she said it sent a chill down Veltar's spine. This wasn't the response of a noble hero ready to sacrifice herself for the greater good. This wasn't the measured wisdom of a seasoned peacekeeper. This was the reaction of someone who saw a job that needed doing and was already figuring out the most effective way to do it. As Jake studied the tactical information, other humans spread throughout the command center, asking questions that made the Coalition officers shift uncomfortably. They wanted to know about ammunition supplies, casualty projections, and whether there were any rules of engagement they needed to worry about. Veltar began to realize that Earth hadn't sent heroes to save the galaxy. They had sent something else entirely. Something that might just be exactly what the situation required. For decades, the Coalition had been fighting what they proudly called the honorable way. Their military academies taught courses on ethical warfare. Their officers carried pocket guides listing 17 different rules about when you could and couldn't fire on enemy positions. They had entire committees dedicated to making sure no innocent bystanders got hurt, even when those bystanders lived on planets that were already being consumed by monsters. The Coalition's battle reports read like textbooks on how to lose a war while maintaining your moral high ground. They would spend weeks evacuating civilian populations before engaging the enemy, giving the Devourers plenty of time to dig in and prepare. They refused to use certain weapons because they were too destructive. They wouldn't attack enemy supply lines if they ran through populated areas. They even had rules about not fighting during certain religious holidays of species that had already been eaten. Meanwhile, the Devourers followed exactly zero rules. They attacked hospitals first because the screaming was louder. They targeted schools because children made better appetizers. They had turned war crimes into an art form, and the Coalition kept responding by being even more careful about their own conduct. When the humans arrived and started reviewing battle footage, their reactions were not what anyone expected. Instead of being impressed by the Coalition's noble restraint, they looked increasingly frustrated. Jake Martinez watched a recording of the Battle of Theta Prime, where Coalition forces had retreated rather than risk damaging a cultural monument, even though the monument was already half-eaten. "You gotta be kidding me," Jake muttered, pausing the video. She turned to face the room full of Coalition commanders, her expression a mix of disbelief and something that might have been professional disappointment. "You've been fighting with both hands tied behind your back, blindfolded, while hopping on one foot." Admiral Kethron of the Crystalline Fleet bristled at the insult. "We fight with honor, human. We don't abandon our principles just because the enemy lacks them." "Principles don't mean much when everyone who held them is dead," Jake replied flatly. She gestured at the tactical display, showing the steady retreat of Coalition forces over the past 2 years. "These things don't take prisoners, they take snacks. And you're still worried about fighting fair?" That's when Jake said something that would be quoted in military academies for generations to come. Time to return the favor. The humans didn't just suggest a new strategy. They completely rewrote the playbook. Where the Coalition saw rules to follow, humans saw suggestions to consider. Where the Coalition saw ethical dilemmas, humans saw problems with obvious solutions. Where the Coalition saw the need for careful deliberation, humans saw the need for immediate action. The Battle of Kepler Station became the moment when the galaxy learned what Earth meant by total war. The station had been a Coalition stronghold for 3 years, but Devourer forces had been slowly eating away at its defenses. Traditional tactics call for evacuating the civilian population and falling back to the next offensive position. Instead, Jake's forces turned the entire station into a weapon. The humans studied the station's blueprints like they were reading a recipe book. Every system, every corridor, every maintenance tunnel became part of their battle plan. They didn't just want to fight the Devourers. They wanted to make the station itself fight back. When the Devourers attacked, they found themselves facing an enemy that had turned the laws of physics into weapons. The humans had rewired the artificial gravity generators, creating zones where enemy forces would suddenly weigh 10 times normal, crushing them against the floors. They had modified the atmospheric systems to create pressure differentials that could slam blast doors with enough force to cut armored enemies in half. The maintenance shafts, which Devourers typically use to bypass Coalition defenses, had been turned into elaborate traps. Motion sensors triggered emergency foam that would expand and harden, trapping intruders until human teams could deal with them. Ventilation systems had been rigged to redirect toxic gases from the station's industrial sectors directly into enemy positions. But perhaps most impressive was what happened when the humans started running low on traditional ammunition. Instead of retreating or calling for resupply, they simply adapted. Kitchen equipment became improvised weapons. Industrial tools were repurposed for combat. One human soldier reportedly defeated 3 Devourers using nothing but a modified food processor and what she called creative engineering. The humans didn't just fight the Devourers. They made fighting back into an art form. Every surface, every system, every piece of equipment became part of their arsenal. They fought like the station itself was alive and angry. For the first time in the entire war, something unprecedented happened. A Devourer fleet actually retreated. Not because they were outgunned or outmaneuvered, but because they were genuinely disturbed by what they had encountered. These creatures, who consumed entire civilizations without a second thought, had met something that fought back in ways that made them uncomfortable. The humans had won not through superior firepower or numbers, but through sheer, creative determination to turn everything around them into a weapon. After Kepler Station, something shifted in the war. For the first time in decades, the tactical maps in coalition command centers started showing green instead of red. System after system fell back into coalition hands as human forces pushed the Devourer fleets into full retreat. The victories kept coming, one after another, like dominoes falling in reverse. But these victories came with a price that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. The humans weren't just winning the war, they were clearly enjoying every minute of it. It started small, with little things that made coalition officers do double takes. Human soldiers began collecting what they called souvenirs from defeated enemies. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Every military collected trophies, right? But these weren't normal war trophies. Captain Tom Riley's crew had started wearing pieces of Devourer exoskeleton as additional armor. Not just small pieces either. Full chest plates, arm guards, even helmets carved from the skulls of their enemies. Riley himself wore a shoulder piece that still had the original owner's claw marks etched into it. When asked about it, he just grinned and said it was practical recycling. The sight of humans walking around wearing parts of their defeated enemies was disturbing enough, but it got worse. The armor wasn't just decorative. They had modified it, improved it, turned it into something more effective than the original. Somehow, human engineers had figured out how to make Devourer bioarmor work better than the Devourers themselves had managed. Lieutenant Amy Thompson took things even further. She had gotten her hands on captured Devourer bioweapons and started modifying them in ways that made seasoned coalition officers physically sick. The weapons now made different sounds when fired, sounds that Amy described as more motivating. When pressed for details, she explained that she had rewired them to produce audio frequencies that Devourers found particularly unpleasant. It's psychological warfare. Amy explained to a group of horrified coalition scientists. If you're going to use their own weapons against them, might as well make sure they really hate the experience. The modifications didn't stop at sound effects. Human engineers had somehow figured out how to make Devourer technology more efficient, more deadly, and significantly more disturbing to face in combat. They had taken weapons designed by a species that fed on terror and made them more terrifying. When coalition officers started filing formal complaints about these practices, the human response was always the same. They would shrug, pull out their casualty reports, and let the numbers speak for themselves. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Human casualty rates were so low, they seemed like clerical errors. Missions that should have cost hundreds of lives were being completed with maybe 3 injuries and a stubbed toe. Battles that historically would have required massive reinforcements were being won by single human squads armed with improvised weapons and bad attitudes. How are you doing this? Admiral Kethron demanded during one particularly heated briefing. Your forces are outnumbered 10-1 in most engagements, and yet you keep winning with minimal losses. Jake Martinez looked up from her tactical display with the expression of someone who had been asked to explain why water was wet. We fight smarter, not harder. Also, we don't spend 3 weeks debating whether it's morally acceptable to shoot back when someone's trying to eat us. Ambassador Veltar, who had been growing more pale and worried with each human victory, finally voiced what everyone was thinking. General Martinez, your methods are concerning. The way your people fight, the weapons they use, the trophies they collect, it's disturbing. Jake leaned back in her chair and gave Veltar a look that was part amusement and part genuine confusion. Look, Ambassador, you asked for help stopping monsters. We're stopping them. You didn't specify how prettily it needed to be done. But surely there are standards. Veltar began. Standards? Jake interrupted. The Devourers have been eating entire civilizations for sport, and you're worried about our standards? Our disturbing methods have liberated more territory in 6 months than your civilized approach managed in 20 years. That was the uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The humans fought like the creatures they were supposed to be defeating. They collected trophies from fallen enemies. They modified captured weapons in ways that made them more terrifying to face. They seemed to take genuine pleasure in finding new and creative ways to defeat their opponents. But they were winning a war that the civilized galaxy had been steadily losing for an entire generation. Every system they liberated meant millions of lives saved. Every Devourer fleet they defeated meant dozens of worlds that wouldn't be consumed. The Coalition had asked for heroes, and heroes were supposed to be noble and inspiring and morally pure. Instead, they had gotten something else entirely, something that worked. The question that kept everyone awake at night wasn't whether the humans could defeat the Devourers. They clearly could, and were doing it more effectively than anyone had thought possible. The real question was what kind of galaxy would be left when the humans were done saving it. The final assault on the Devourer homeworld was planned like any other human military operation, which is exactly what made it so terrifying to everyone else involved. While Coalition forces expected dramatic speeches about justice and freedom, the humans treated it like they were planning the demolition of an old building, methodical, thorough, and completely professional. Jake Martinez stood in the command center of the flagship, surrounded by tactical displays and communication screens, coordinating what she simply called pest control on a planetary scale. There were no inspiring battle cries or noble declarations. Instead, there were work schedules, supply requisitions, and efficiency reports. Team Alpha, you're responsible for the northern continent, she announced over the comm system. Team Beta takes the southern landmass. Remember, we're not here to conquer territory. We're here to solve a problem permanently. Ambassador Veltar and the other Coalition representatives watched in growing horror as the human forces deployed across the planet with the same casual efficiency they might use to clean a house. Every movement was calculated. Every action had a purpose. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary drama, just humans doing what they did best, solving problems in the most direct way possible. The humans had studied the Devourers more thoroughly than anyone in the Coalition had ever bothered to do. While Coalition scientists had spent decades trying to understand their psychology and culture, human researchers had focused on biology and reproduction cycles. They knew exactly where every breeding facility was located. They had mapped every spawning ground, cataloged every egg chamber, and identified every possible hiding place where survivors might try to rebuild. Intelligence reports 97% of breeding sites have been neutralized, reported Captain Tom Riley from the surface. His voice carried the same tone someone might use to update their boss about inventory management. Estimated completion time for remaining targets is 6 hours. What disturbed the Coalition observers wasn't the efficiency. It was a complete lack of emotion. The humans weren't angry or vengeful. They weren't fighting for justice or freedom, or any of the noble causes that usually motivated galactic conflicts. They were simply doing a job that needed to be done, and they were very, very good at their work. Lieutenant Amy Thompson's voice crackled through the communications array. Found a deep cave system that wasn't on the original maps. Looks like they were trying to hide some breeding stock down there. Don't worry, we'll get it cleaned up. Cleaned up. That's how the humans talk about completely eliminating a species that had terrorized the galaxy for generations. Like they were janitors dealing with a particularly stubborn stain. The thoroughness was what really got to everyone. Coalition forces might have been satisfied with defeating the Devourer military and securing the major population centers. The humans weren't satisfied until they had accounted for every possible trace of their enemy. They checked places that Coalition forces would never have thought to look. They verified their work multiple times. They even brought in specialists to make sure nothing had been missed. Jake stood in what had once been the Devourer capital city, watching her troops conduct their final sweeps with professional detachment of exterminators finishing a job. The city was empty now, not destroyed in some dramatic battle, but simply evacuated of anything that could ever threaten another world. Problem solved, she announced over the comm system, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had completed a difficult task successfully. These particular monsters won't be bothering anyone ever again. All units begin withdrawal procedures. The Coalition representatives who witnessed the final assault would never speak publicly about what they saw. There were no official reports filed, no detailed accounts entered into the historical record. The operation was quietly classified at the highest levels and buried in archives that most people didn't even know existed. In private, however, they would sometimes gather in small groups and admit a truth that kept them awake at night. They had begged the universe for heroes to save them from monsters. They had imagined noble warriors who would defeat evil through courage and righteousness. Instead, the universe had sent them something that was arguably more frightening than what they had been fighting. The humans hadn't defeated the Devourers through superior technology or overwhelming numbers. They had won through superior planning, ruthless efficiency, and a complete willingness to do whatever was necessary to solve the problem permanently. They fought like the monsters they were supposed to be defeating, but they fought for the right side. As the human fleet prepared to depart, leaving behind a planet that would never again threaten anyone, the Coalition faced a new reality. They were safe now, but they had learned something about their saviors that would change how they saw the universe forever. The humans had saved the galaxy not through heroism, but through competence, and that, somehow, was far more disturbing than any monster they had ever faced. The cleanup after the war took 3 months, but it felt like 3 years to everyone involved. Coalition forces had expected the usual post-war chaos. Displaced populations, damaged infrastructure, political negotiations about rebuilding efforts. Instead, they found themselves dealing with something much more unsettling, a galaxy that was suddenly completely and permanently safe from a threat that had haunted them for generations. The humans handled the aftermath with the same disturbing efficiency they had brought to the actual fighting. They filed neat reports documenting exactly what they had accomplished. They provided detailed maps of areas that had been cleaned. They even left behind instruction manuals for dealing with any Devourer technology that might be discovered in the future, though everyone knew there wouldn't be any future discoveries. Ambassador Veltar spent most of those 3 months trying to process what he had witnessed. The war was over. The galaxy was safe. The Devourers were extinct. Mission accomplished, as the humans like to say. But instead of feeling relief or gratitude, he found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand exactly what his people had unleashed when they sent out that desperate call for help. The humans had solved the problem, yes, but they had solved it in a way that raised entirely new questions. Questions that no one really wanted to ask out loud, but that everyone was thinking about during those quiet moments when they thought they were alone. The Coalition's greatest military minds had spent decades trying to figure out how to defeat the Devourers while maintaining some semblance of civilized behavior. The humans had taken one look at the situation and decided that civilized behavior was a luxury they couldn't afford. They had fought like the monsters they were hired to eliminate, and they had won decisively. But now the Coalition knew something that would forever change how they saw the universe. Somewhere out there in the dark, on a small blue planet that most species had ignored, lived beings who called themselves peacekeepers, but who fought like the very nightmares they had been hired to eliminate. As the human fleet prepared for departure, their ships once again looking like flying junkyards held together with determination and spare parts, Veltar found himself with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. He made his way to the flagship, where Jake Martinez was conducting her final inspections before the journey home. General Martinez. He called out as she was about to board her ship. She turned, that same casual expression on her scarred face that had made him uncomfortable from the very beginning. "Ambassador," she nodded. "Something on your mind?" Veltar hesitated, then asked a question that had been haunting him for weeks. "Will you be coming back?" Jake's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide how honest to be with her answer. Finally, she smiled, and somehow that smile was even less reassuring than her usual serious expression. "Only if you need us to," she said simply. "Hope you don't." That was it. No promises of eternal friendship, no offers of ongoing alliance, no suggestion that humanity wanted to play a larger role in galactic affairs. Just a simple statement that they would return if called upon, and a sincere hope that such a call would never be necessary. As Veltar watched the human ships disappear into hyperspace, their primitive-looking vessels somehow managing to achieve faster-than-light travel despite appearing to be held together with luck and stubbornness, he realized that the galaxy now faced a fundamentally different kind of future. For generations, the coalition had maintained peace through diplomacy, negotiation, and the understanding that all civilized species shared certain basic values about how conflict should be resolved. They had built their entire society around the belief that problems could be solved through reason and compromise. The humans had shown them a different approach. When faced with an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with, that wouldn't compromise, that existed only to cause suffering, the humans had simply removed that enemy from existence. Permanently, efficiently, completely. The galaxy was now safe, but it was a new kind of safety. Not the safety that came from everyone agreeing to follow the same rules, but the safety that came from knowing that somewhere in the darkness, there were beings willing and able to break every rule if breaking those rules was what it took to protect innocent lives. The coalition members went back to their committees and their debates and their careful diplomatic protocols, but they all knew that the universe had fundamentally changed. They had learned that when civilization wasn't enough, when diplomacy failed, when the monsters came calling, there was a little blue world full of even bigger monsters who would answer the call. It was a comforting thought and a terrifying one, all at the same time. The galaxy slept peacefully, knowing that Earth's heroes were waiting for the next call for help and hoping with all their hearts that such a call would never come, because now they knew exactly what kind of help they would get.